Radio check. This is Captain Nightwhisper. Before we open the classified file for tonight, I need to have a very honest word with the squad. You know that I operate in the shadows. You know that I dig deep to find these hidden military encounters. But the algorithm on this platform is a brutal and unforgiving battlefield. Producing these full-length audio movies takes weeks of intense research, writing, and heavy editing. I pour all of my energy and resources into this channel. Lately, the transmissions have not been reaching as many operators as they should. The views are lower than the effort demands, but I refuse to stop broadcasting. If you enjoy this deep immersion into military horror, I need your backup. Please hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment below. Share this transmission with anyone who loves the dark. Your absolute loyalty is the only fuel that keeps this radio tower alive. Now prepare yourselves, check your thermal gear, turn off the lights, put your headphones on. Tonight we are deploying to the roof of the world. Let us begin. The Pamir Mountain range is often called the roof of the world. It is located in the extreme northeastern corner of Afghanistan. The Wakhan corridor is a narrow strip of freezing rock and ice. It separates Afghanistan from Tajikistan to the north and China to the east. It is one of the most isolated regions on the entire planet. The altitude averages 15,000 feet above sea level. The air is dangerously thin. The human body is not designed to survive in this environment. Every single breath requires conscious physical effort. In the winter of 2009, the United States military maintained a highly classified observation facility in this region. It was designated as Outpost November. The facility was not built by American engineers. It was originally constructed by the Soviet Union during their occupation in the 1980s. It was a massive, brutalist concrete structure carved directly into the side of a frozen cliff. The walls were 3 feet thick. The windows were narrow horizontal slits fitted with heavy ballistic glass. The main entrance was secured by a pair of solid steel blast doors. The Americans had simply moved in, upgraded the communication arrays, and installed heavy diesel generators to keep the cold out. My Special Forces team was deployed to Outpost November for a routine 30-day rotation. There were 6 of us. We were elite operators. We had survived intense urban combat in Iraq and heavy firefights in the southern Afghan deserts. We thought a month of isolated guard duty in the snow would be a quiet assignment. We were completely wrong. The first week at the outpost was physically exhausting, but completely uneventful. We spent our days monitoring long-range radar equipment. We scanned the frozen valleys for insurgent smuggling routes. We maintained the heavy weapons mounted on the observation deck. We exercised in the narrow concrete hallways to keep our muscles from deteriorating in the extreme altitude. The environment outside the thick concrete walls was totally dead. There were no animals. There were no local shepherds. There was only endless white snow and jagged gray rock. On the 8th day of our deployment, the sky changed. It did not happen slowly. There were no dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The bright blue sky simply vanished. It was replaced by a thick, heavy blanket of absolute gray. The temperature outside plummeted 20 degrees in a matter of minutes. The barometric pressure dropped so fast that my ears experienced a sharp physical pain. Then the storm arrived. It was not a normal mountain blizzard. It hit the concrete walls of Outpost November like a physical weapon. The wind did not howl. It produced a continuous, deafening roar that vibrated through the solid floors of the facility. The visibility outside dropped to absolute zero. The heavy ballistic windows were instantly covered in a thick layer of solid ice. The world outside the glass became a solid wall of moving white. We were completely sealed inside. Sergeant Miller was our primary communications specialist. He sat in the main control room wearing heavy headphones. He stared at the digital monitors of his communication suite. He called out to Captain Edwards. His voice was incredibly tense. Miller reported that the primary satellite uplink was down. The thick storm clouds were blocking the signal. He immediately switched to the high-frequency radio array to contact Bagram Airfield. He transmitted our emergency call sign. He waited for a response. The radio speaker only emitted a harsh, continuous wave of aggressive static. There was no voice. There was no acknowledgement. We were entirely cut off from the rest of the military. Captain Edwards remained calm. He ordered us to check the perimeter security systems. He ordered us to secure the interior blast doors. We had enough diesel fuel, food, and water to last for 3 months. We were tactically secure. We just had to wait out the storm. But the cold began to penetrate the facility. The massive diesel generators in the basement were running at maximum capacity. The industrial heaters pushed warm air through the metal ventilation shafts. It was not enough. The unnatural freezing temperature from outside was seeping through 3 feet of solid concrete. Frost began to form on the interior walls of our sleeping quarters. Our breath turned into white vapor inside the control room. We had to put on our heavy winter tactical gear just to walk down the hallways. At exactly 0200 hours, the first anomaly occurred. The outpost was equipped with advanced thermal motion sensors. They were planted in the snow 50 yards away from the main blast doors. The sensors were designed to detect the body heat of approaching enemy combatants. The security alarm panel in the control room suddenly illuminated. A bright red light flashed rapidly on the digital console. The alarm indicated that something large had just crossed the southern perimeter line. I immediately grabbed my rifle. I moved to the main observation window. I wiped the condensation off the thick ballistic glass. I stared out into the raging white storm. I expected to see a lost mountain leopard or perhaps a massive snowdrift triggering the sensor. There was nothing but the violent, swirling snow. I looked back at the security console. The red light was still flashing, but the thermal reading was impossible. The sensor was not detecting a warm body. It was detecting an entity that was significantly colder than the surrounding blizzard. It was registering a massive moving void of absolute zero temperature. Then, the dead radio on the communication desk suddenly stopped broadcasting static. The frequency shifted completely on its own. The harsh noise was replaced by a crystal clear audio transmission, but it was not the military command center. A voice began to whisper through the speaker. It was a woman's voice. She was speaking in a slow, rhythmic cadence. She was reciting a very specific address in Chicago. She was reciting the names of 2 young children. I felt the blood freeze inside my veins. I looked across the room at Sergeant Miller. He was staring at the radio with wide, terrified eyes. The heavy radio headset fell from his shaking hands. The voice on the radio was his wife. She was whispering his home address. She was calling out the names of his children from the other side of the planet, but she sounded completely hollow. She sounded like she had been dead for a very long time. The storm outside seemed to roar even louder. Something was waiting for us in the white silence. Sergeant Miller did not move. He stared at the communication console. The radio speaker continued to broadcast the voice of his wife. She was whispering the names of his children over and over again. The tone of her voice was completely flat. There was no emotion. It sounded like an audio recording playing from the bottom of a deep well. Captain Edwards reacted immediately. He did not issue a verbal command. He simply walked across the control room, grabbed the thick black power cable connected to the radio array, and pulled it out of the wall socket. The digital screens on the communication desk instantly died. The green lights faded into black. The radio lost all electrical power. But the voice did not stop. The whisper was no longer coming from the electronic speaker. It was coming from the heavy metal ventilation shafts above our heads. The voice of Miller's wife drifted down through the iron grates, carried by the freezing air. It echoed softly against the concrete walls of the outpost. "Open the door, David," the voice whispered from the ceiling. "It is so cold out here. The children are freezing. Please let us inside." David was Sergeant Miller's first name. None of us use first names on deployment. The entity outside did not just hack our radio frequency. It was reading our minds. It was digging into our memories to find our absolute weakest points. Miller dropped to his knees. He covered his ears with his heavy tactical gloves. He closed his eyes tightly and began to recite standard military radio protocols, trying to block out the impossible sound. Captain Edwards ordered everyone to arm themselves. He ordered us to load armor-piercing ammunition into our weapons. We secured our heavy ceramic vests. I pulled the charging handle of my rifle. The metal mechanism felt like solid ice against my skin. We moved out of the control room and entered the main corridor. The narrow hallway connected the living quarters to the front observation deck. The temperature inside the corridor was dropping rapidly. Thick white frost covered the exposed steel pipes on the ceiling. The heavy diesel generators in the basement were still running, but their heat was completely consumed by the unnatural cold radiating from the storm outside. I reached the front observation deck. The room was dark. The only light came from the violent, swirling snow pressing against the thick ballistic windows. I raised my thermal optics. I looked through the heavy glass. The blizzard was a chaotic wall of white and gray, but my thermal sensors registered 3 distinct anomalies standing 50 yards away from the outpost. They were not glowing red or orange like human bodies. They were absolute voids of thermal energy. They were so incredibly cold that they registered as pitch-black silhouettes against the freezing storm. They were not moving. They were standing perfectly still, facing the concrete walls of our facility. I lowered my thermal optics. I strained my eyes to see through the physical glass. The wind shifted for a fraction of a second, parting the heavy curtain of snow. I finally saw them with my own eyes. There were 3 figures standing in the deep snow, but they were not human. They stood at least 8 feet tall. Their limbs were incredibly thin and disproportionately long. Their arms hung completely past their knees. They did not have any visible body fat or muscle mass. They looked like walking skeletons draped in loose fabric. But the most terrifying detail was their clothing. They were wearing military uniforms. The fabric was heavily torn and faded. It was white winter camouflage. The specific pattern was completely outdated. It was standard issue for the Soviet Spetsnaz units during their invasion of the region in the 1980s. The Soviet soldiers who had built this very outpost had never left the mountain. They had been claimed by the storm. They had been hollowed out and turned into hunting dogs for the freezing dark. I turned to Captain Edwards. I tried to speak, but my throat was completely dry. I pointed toward the ballistic window. The captain stepped forward to look, but the figures were already gone. The storm had swallowed them completely. Then, the heavy steel blast doors at the main entrance began to vibrate. Something massive was standing right outside our walls. The main entrance to Outpost November consisted of an exterior steel blast door and an interior security gate. They were separated by a narrow concrete airlock. The exterior door was constructed from 3 inches of solid, military-grade steel. It was designed to withstand a direct hit from a heavy mortar shell. It was locked from the inside with 3 massive iron deadbolts. We stood in the main corridor, aiming our rifles at the interior security gate. We waited for an explosive breach. We expected the deafening roar of a shaped charge or a rocket-propelled grenade. We received something much worse. The assault did not begin with explosives. It began with the horrific sound of metal tearing against metal. The entities outside were not using tools. They were using their bare hands. Long, deep scratches echoed through the thick steel. It sounded like massive iron nails being dragged slowly across a chalkboard. The noise was physically painful. It vibrated directly into our teeth and deep into our jawbones. Private Jackson was the youngest member of our team. He was standing to my right. His rifle was trembling violently in his hands. He was sweating despite the freezing temperature inside the hallway. The entities changed their tactic. The violent scratching suddenly stopped. The dead silence returned for a few seconds. Then a new voice spoke from the other side of the heavy steel door. It was not the voice of Miller's wife. "Jackson, I am bleeding out," the voice cried in agony. "They hit the convoy. I cannot feel my legs. You left me behind, man." "Why did you leave me?" Private Jackson gasped. All the color drained from his face. The voice belonged to Corporal Thomas. He was a close friend of Jackson. But Thomas was not in Afghanistan. He had died 2 years ago during a brutal urban ambush in the city of Fallujah. Jackson had been in the same vehicle. He had watched his friend bleed to death in the dirt. The entity outside the door perfectly mimicked the exact tone of panic and pain that Thomas had used in his final moments. It was weaponized guilt. "He is alive," Private Jackson whispered. His eyes were wide and completely dilated. His mind was rapidly fracturing under the psychological pressure. "Thomas is outside. He is freezing. We have to bring him inside." "Stand down, Private," Captain Edwards ordered. His voice was firm and commanding. "That is not your friend. That is a psychological weapon. Maintain your discipline." But Jackson was no longer listening to the captain. The guilt and the unnatural cold had broken his rational mind. He lowered his weapon. He took a step toward the interior security gate. He reached for the heavy iron wheel that controlled the airlock mechanism. "I am coming, brother," Jackson yelled toward the steel door. "Hold on, I am going to open it." I dropped my rifle. I lunged forward and grabbed Jackson by the heavy straps of his tactical vest. I pulled him backward with all my physical strength. He fought back wildly. He swung his elbows and kicked at my legs. He was fighting with the desperate, hysterical strength of a madman. Captain Edwards stepped in. He grabbed Jackson's arms and pinned them behind his back. We dragged the young soldier away from the airlock mechanism. We threw him onto the cold concrete floor. I pressed my knee into his chest to keep him pinned down. Jackson screamed and cried, begging us to open the door. While we were struggling on the floor, the entities outside lost their patience. They realized their psychological trick had failed. The deception was over. Now they relied on pure, brutal force. A massive impact struck the exterior steel blast door. It did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like a massive boulder being thrown by a giant. The entire outpost violently shook. The thick concrete walls groaned under the immense pressure. Dust and small fragments of rock fell from the ceiling. The heavy iron deadbolts locking the door bent inward slightly. Another massive impact struck the steel. The sound was deafening. The 3-inch thick military steel began to warp. A long, visible dent appeared in the center of the door. They were not trying to pick the lock. They were going to beat the steel door down until it shattered, and we had nowhere left to run. The mountain was locked, the radio was dead, and the pale things in the snow were very hungry. The massive impacts against the exterior steel door continued with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. The entities were not growing tired. They possessed an impossible mechanical stamina. The heavy iron deadbolts holding the door began to shear off their mounts. The thick metal hinges screamed under the immense pressure. Captain Edwards realized the airlock was going to fail. He ordered us to fall back down the main corridor. We dragged Private Jackson with us. We established a defensive perimeter 30 yards away from the entrance. We took cover behind heavy concrete barricades. We aimed our rifles directly at the interior security gate. We waited for the breach. The temperature in the hallway dropped well below zero. The condensation inside my tactical visor instantly turned to solid ice. My fingers were completely numb despite the heavy thermal gloves. A final devastating impact struck the exterior door. The freezing temperature had fundamentally altered the molecular structure of the military-grade steel. The metal had become completely brittle. The center of the massive blast door did not bend. It shattered exactly like cheap glass. Thick, jagged pieces of frozen steel exploded across the airlock. A fraction of a second later, the interior security gate was violently torn completely off its hinges. The heavy iron gate flew down the corridor and crashed against the concrete wall. The mountain storm poured directly into our facility. A thick, impenetrable wall of white freezing fog rolled down the hallway toward our barricade. "Engage all targets," Captain Edwards commanded. His voice cut through the roaring wind. We opened fire simultaneously. We emptied our 30-round magazines directly into the approaching white fog. The enclosed space of the concrete hallway amplified the deafening roar of our weapons. The bright orange muzzle flashes illuminated the thick mist like a violent strobe light. Through the flashing light of the gunfire, we finally saw them clearly. The pale entities moved with terrifying, unnatural speed. They did not run like human soldiers. They appeared to glide across the frozen concrete floor. Their long, disproportionate limbs moved in sharp, erratic jerks. The faded Soviet winter camouflage hung loosely around their skeletal frames. Our armor-piercing rounds found their targets. The heavy bullets struck the chests and shoulders of the entities. But they did not fall. There was no blood. When a bullet penetrated their pale flesh, a thick burst of dry ice and gray dust erupted from the wound. They did not even flinch. They simply absorbed the kinetic energy and continued to advance. One of the entities reached our concrete barricade before we could reload our weapons. It loomed over Corporal Jenkins. The creature was incredibly tall. It reached down with a long, pale hand. It did not try to bite him. It did not use a weapon. It simply placed its freezing palm flat against the center of Jenkins's tactical vest. Jenkins stopped screaming immediately. His eyes went completely wide. The thick ceramic plates in his vest instantly froze solid. The unnatural, absolute cold penetrated straight through his ribs. It stopped his heart in a single fraction of a second. His skin turned a sickly, pale gray. He fell backward onto the floor, completely lifeless. Our weapons were entirely useless against the cold. Captain Edwards ordered a full tactical retreat to the lower levels. We abandoned the barricade. We left the frozen body of Corporal Jenkins on the floor. We ran toward the heavy steel stairwell leading down into the basement. We had to reach the diesel generators. We had to find the heat. We descended the concrete stairs and reached the heavy steel door of the basement. We rushed inside and locked the thick metal deadbolts behind us. The basement was a massive, cavernous room. It housed the primary power systems for Outpost November. 3 enormous industrial diesel generators dominated the center of the space. The air down here was incredibly thick. It smelled heavily of burnt oil, diesel fuel, and exhaust fumes. The heavy engines roared continuously. They provided our electricity, and more importantly, they provided massive amounts of ambient heat. For a brief moment, we felt safe. The warmth of the basement began to thaw the ice on our tactical gear. I could finally feel the blood circulating in my frozen fingers. But the entities did not need to break down the basement door. They were already inside the walls of the facility. The freezing fog began to seep aggressively through the metal ventilation shafts positioned directly above the massive generators. The thick white mist poured down like a slow waterfall. The thick frost rapidly crawled down the exterior iron pipes of the engines. It reached the primary fuel lines. The military-grade diesel fuel was chemically treated to resist extreme winter conditions. But this was not a natural mountain blizzard. This was an ancient, weaponized cold. The massive engines began to choke. The deep, reliable mechanical rhythm turned into a violent, erratic sputter. The heavy iron engine blocks physically cracked under the rapid, impossible temperature drop. Then the primary generator died completely. The secondary generators failed a few seconds later. The heavy, comforting roar of the engines was replaced by absolute silence. The overhead lights in the basement instantly went black. We were plunged into total, suffocating darkness. We activated the white tactical lights mounted on the barrels of our rifles. The bright beams cut frantically through the thick fog filling the room. We formed a tight defensive circle in the center of the basement, standing back to back. We pointed our weapons in every direction. We waited for the attack. But the entities did not make a single sound. They did not breathe. They did not have heartbeats. They perfectly blended into the freezing dark. Suddenly, Private Jackson broke our defensive circle. His mind was completely shattered. The psychological torture and the unnatural cold had destroyed his last remaining fragment of sanity. He lowered his rifle. He allowed the weapon to hang uselessly from its tactical sling. He walked slowly away from our group, heading directly into the darkest corner of the basement fog. He was whispering the name of his dead friend. He was apologizing for leaving him in the desert. Captain Edwards yelled at him to stop. I reached out to grab his shoulder, but he was already too far away. The thick white mist swallowed him completely. We kept our flashlights aimed at the spot where he disappeared. We waited to hear the sounds of a struggle. We waited for a scream of pain. We heard absolutely nothing. Private Jackson simply vanished into the freezing void. The dark claimed him in total silence. We were now down to 3 men, myself, Captain Edwards, and Sergeant Miller. Captain Edwards slowly lowered his rifle. He realized that our military training was entirely useless here. We could not shoot the blizzard. We could not arrest the cold. The entities fed on our body heat, and they used the freezing temperature as a blade. Our only remaining defense was fire. The captain turned to us. His breath formed thick clouds in the dying light of our flashlights. He ordered us to open the emergency fuel reserves. He ordered us to take the heavy axes from the fire suppression kits and smash the auxiliary diesel tanks. We began pouring thousands of gallons of highly flammable liquid directly onto the concrete floor of the basement. If the pale entities wanted Outpost November, we were going to burn it to the ground. We swung the heavy red fire axes with desperate, exhausted strength. The thick iron walls of the auxiliary diesel tanks ruptured under the repeated impacts. Thousands of gallons of military-grade fuel flooded the concrete floor of the basement. The thick, viscous liquid soaked into our tactical boots. The pungent, chemical smell of the diesel overpowered the foul scent of the ancient cold. Captain Edwards dropped his axe. He reached into the deep pockets of his tactical vest. He retrieved a standard-issue emergency illumination flare. He gripped the thick cardboard tube in his left hand. He removed the plastic safety cap. He struck the ignition surface with a violent, sweeping motion. A brilliant, blinding red light erupted in the absolute darkness. The chemical fire burned incredibly hot. The intense red glow illuminated the thick white fog that was slowly descending upon us from the ceiling. Captain Edwards did not hesitate. He threw the burning red flare directly into the center of the massive pool of diesel fuel. The ignition was instantaneous. A massive wave of bright orange fire rapidly swept across the entire basement floor. The flames roared with a deep, consuming hunger. The ambient temperature in the room spiked dramatically. The intense heat physically pushed the freezing white fog back against the concrete walls. For the first time in several hours, I felt genuine warmth radiating against my face. The ice on my ceramic armor plates began to melt, dripping down my uniform in heavy drops of water. We raised our rifles, we aimed our weapons at the burning shadows. We waited to see the pale entities burn. We waited to watch them turn to ash. But the relief of the fire did not last. The entities did not retreat from the flames. They did not show any physical signs of fear. 3 impossibly tall silhouettes stepped out of the dark corners of the basement. They walked directly into the raging inferno. The extreme heat immediately ignited their faded Soviet winter camouflage. The old, dry fabric caught fire instantly. The burning uniforms revealed their true physical forms. They were not made of normal biological flesh. Their bodies were completely devoid of muscle or fat. Their skin resembled ancient, petrified ice. It was translucent and incredibly rigid. I could see thick, dark veins running beneath the surface, but no blood flowed through them. Their long, skeletal fingers ended in jagged, broken points. Their faces lacked any human features. They had no eyes. They had no mouths. Their heads were simply smooth, pale voids of frozen tissue. The flames licked aggressively against their long limbs, but they did not burn. Instead, the entities began to actively fight the fire simply by existing. The unnatural, absolute cold radiating from their bodies was vastly superior to the chemical heat. Where their bare feet stepped, the roaring orange flames were instantly extinguished. The burning diesel fuel rapidly froze solid beneath their heels. The intense heat of the room began to vanish. The bright yellow flames slowly turned into thick columns of choking black smoke. The entities were consuming our fire. They were absorbing the energy of the diesel fuel and turning it back into freezing darkness. Our final defensive tactic had completely failed. We had not killed the monsters. We had only turned the basement into a toxic, suffocating death trap. "We cannot hold this position," Captain Edwards yelled over the roar of the dying fire. "Move to the upper levels. We have to reach the roof access. Move!" We turned our backs to the advancing entities. We sprinted through the thick black smoke, heading toward the heavy steel staircase at the far end of the basement. We had to escape the fire, and we had to escape the cold. The basement was rapidly filling with highly toxic black smoke. The massive diesel fire was aggressively consuming all the breathable oxygen in the enclosed room. My lungs burned with every single breath. My eyes watered heavily under my tactical goggles. I could barely see the concrete floor in front of me. We moved blindly toward the steel staircase. The thick metal steps were our only escape route back to the main level of the facility. But the pale entities were incredibly fast. One of the towering figures suddenly materialized directly in front of the staircase, blocking our path. It stood perfectly still at the bottom of the metal steps. The dying flames raged all around its feet, but its petrified, icy flesh remained completely untouched by the fire. The creature slowly raised one long, skeletal hand. It pointed a jagged, frozen finger directly at Sergeant Miller. The entity did not attack him physically. It used its most devastating weapon. It bypassed our ceramic armor and attacked the human mind. The voice of Miller's wife suddenly echoed through the basement, but she was no longer whispering calmly. She was screaming in absolute agonizing pain. The horrific sound of a woman burning alive filled the dark room. She begged David to save her. She begged him to pull her out of the fire. The auditory illusion was flawless. It sounded exactly like a human being experiencing the ultimate physical torture. The sound broke Sergeant Miller completely. His military discipline shattered into a million pieces. The heavy tactical rifle slipped from his trembling hands. It clattered uselessly against the concrete floor. He fell to his knees directly into the burning diesel fuel. He did not seem to notice the flames burning the fabric of his uniform. He reached his empty arms out toward the towering monster. He was weeping uncontrollably. "I'm right here," Miller sobbed, staring up at the faceless entity. "I am here. I will save you." "Miller, stand up," Captain Edwards commanded. He grabbed the sergeant by the heavy straps of his vest. He tried to pull him away from the creature, but Miller fought back with desperate, insane strength. He pushed the captain away and crawled forward on his hands and knees. The pale entity took a single step forward. It loomed over the weeping soldier. It slowly lowered its skeletal hand. It placed its freezing, translucent palm directly onto the top of Miller's Kevlar helmet. The effect was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. The thick Kevlar material of the military helmet cracked violently under the sudden temperature drop. The unnatural cold shot directly downward, penetrating Miller's skull. His body went completely rigid in the middle of a scream. A thick layer of white frost rapidly expanded outward from the point of contact. It covered Miller's face, his tactical vest, and his boots in less than 3 seconds. The agonizing screams of his wife suddenly ceased. The basement fell into a heavy, terrible silence, broken only by the crackling of the dying fire. Sergeant Miller was completely frozen solid. He was transformed into a pale gray statue kneeling in the ashes. Captain Edwards did not waste time mourning. He knew Miller was already dead the moment he dropped his rifle. The captain grabbed the back of my tactical vest. He violently shoved me toward the narrow gap between the creature and the steel railing of the stairs. "Go!" the captain roared. "Do not look back!" I squeezed past the towering entity. The ambient cold radiating from its body was so intense that it physically burned the exposed skin on my neck. I scrambled frantically up the metal steps. My heavy boots slipped on the grated steel, but I refused to stop moving. Captain Edwards followed right behind me. We reached the top of the staircase and burst through the heavy steel door. We tumbled onto the concrete floor of the main hallway. We immediately kicked the heavy steel door shut. We engaged the thick iron deadbolts, sealing the entrance. We locked the toxic smoke, the dying fire, and the pale monsters in the basement. But as we lay gasping for air in the freezing hallway, we realized the terrible truth. We were trapped on the main level. The exterior blast doors were destroyed. The basement was compromised. There was only one direction left to go. We had to climb to the roof. We had to face the storm. We lay on the freezing concrete floor of the main hallway. The heavy steel door of the basement was sealed shut behind us, but the metal was already beginning to change. A thick layer of white frost bloomed rapidly across the iron deadbolts. The temperature of the metal was dropping so fast that the steel began to emit a high-pitched, agonizing structural whine. The entities were not going to stay in the basement. They were coming up. Captain Edwards pulled me to my feet. He pointed down the dark corridor toward the vertical access shaft. It was a narrow concrete tube containing a rusted iron ladder. It led directly to the flat roof of the facility. It was our absolute last resort. We had to expose ourselves to the extreme weather. We had to leave the concrete walls entirely. We ran down the hallway. Our boots slipped violently on the smooth patches of ice forming on the floor. I looked over my shoulder. The heavy steel door of the basement suddenly fractured. It did not explode outward. It simply crumbled into a pile of frozen, jagged shards. The metal had become as brittle as cheap glass. The thick white fog poured out of the stairwell, carrying the towering pale silhouettes with it. We reached the vertical shaft. I slung my empty rifle over my back. I grabbed the iron rungs of the ladder. The metal burned my hands straight through my thick tactical gloves. The cold was absolute and unforgiving. I began to climb. The shaft was incredibly narrow. My heavy ceramic armor plates scraped harshly against the rough concrete walls. The air was dangerously thin at this altitude. Every single movement required immense physical effort. My lungs burned with a deep, consuming agony. Captain Edwards climbed directly beneath me. He was moving slower than usual. The extreme temperature was draining the life from his muscles. I looked down between my boots. The freezing fog was rising rapidly at the bottom of the concrete shaft. The entities had reached the ladder. The long, skeletal fingers of the pale creatures reached into the tube. They began to climb the iron structure. But they did not climb like human beings. They did not use their legs. They pulled their massive, unnatural bodies upward using only their elongated arms. They moved with terrifying mechanical speed. Their movements were entirely silent. There was no heavy breathing. There was no sound of exertion. They simply glided up the metal rungs in the dark. We reached the top of the shaft. The heavy steel hatch leading to the roof was sealed tight. I pushed upward against the metal with both hands. It did not move a single inch. The raging storm outside had frozen the external hinges completely solid. Ice had welded the door shut. I panicked. I pushed again with all my remaining strength. It was entirely useless. I was trapped. Captain Edwards reached the top step. He saw the frozen hatch. He looked down the deep concrete shaft. The pale entities were less than 20 feet below us. The freezing ambient temperature radiating from their ascending bodies was suffocating. The moisture in my eyes began to crystallize. Captain Edwards drew his heavy combat knife. He wedged the thick steel blade deep into the frozen seal of the hatch. He struck the handle of the knife with the palm of his hand. He used brutal, desperate physical force. The thick ice shattered. The heavy metal hatch blew open violently. The atmospheric pressure of the mountain storm instantly sucked the stagnant air out of the concrete shaft. We pulled ourselves over the edge. We rolled onto the flat concrete roof of Outpost November. We were immediately swallowed by the white silence. The environment on the roof was fundamentally hostile to all human life. The blizzard hit us with the kinetic force of a moving freight train. The wind was not merely blowing. It was a solid physical wall of freezing pressure. I was instantly thrown onto my back. I slid helplessly across the ice-covered concrete. I desperately grabbed the base of a heavy iron ventilation pipe to stop myself from falling over the edge of the mountain cliff. The visibility was absolutely zero. I could not see my own boots. I could only see the violent, swirling gray and white chaos. The temperature was impossible to calculate. It felt like breathing liquid nitrogen. My lungs seized completely. My vision narrowed into a dark tunnel. Captain Edwards crawled across the sheet of ice toward me. He grabbed the heavy shoulder strap of my tactical vest. He pulled his face inches away from my visor. I could barely hear his voice over the deafening, continuous roar of the storm. He pointed toward the center of the roof. The primary communication mast was located there. It was a heavy steel tower anchored directly into the concrete. Attached to the base of the tower was a manual emergency distress beacon. It operated on a completely separate analog frequency. It was designed by the military to transmit a continuous emergency signal, regardless of severe weather conditions. It was our only hope of rescue. We crawled on our stomachs. The wind threatened to tear us right off the mountain and throw us into the deep valley below. We slowly reached the base of the steel tower. Captain Edwards opened the heavy metal box containing the beacon. He engaged the manual override sequence. He pulled the heavy red lever downward. A bright, pulsing amber light activated on the side of the box. The signal was successfully broadcasting. But the victory was entirely hollow. I looked back toward the open access hatch. The pale entities had finally reached the roof. They stepped out of the concrete shaft and into the raging blizzard. The storm did not slow them down. The violent, freezing wind did not affect their movements. They were a natural part of the freezing void. They stood completely upright, towering high above us. The faded Soviet camouflage whipped violently around their skeletal bodies. They slowly walked toward the communication tower. Captain Edwards looked at the approaching entities. He looked at the pulsing amber light of the distress beacon. He realized that the rescue helicopters would not arrive for several hours. We would not survive that long. The cold would consume us in minutes. He unclipped a heavy nylon safety carabiner from his tactical belt. He attached one end of the strap to the heavy steel ring on the back of my vest. He locked the other end directly to the thick iron struts of the communication tower. He was physically securing me to the structure. I realized what he was doing. I grabbed his arm. I shook my head wildly. I tried to scream, but the violent wind stole the sound directly from my lungs. I begged him not to leave me alone. Captain Edwards ignored my protests. He drew his heavy combat knife. He did not draw his rifle. He knew the bullets were completely useless. He stood up slowly. He turned his back to me and faced the advancing monsters. He did not run away. He did not surrender to the cold. He walked directly forward into the towering, pale silhouettes. The three entities immediately surrounded him. Their massive, skeletal hands reached out from the swirling snow. They touched his shoulders and his chest simultaneously. Captain Edwards froze in place. A thick layer of white ice instantly covered his entire body. He did not even have the time to scream. He became a rigid, frozen monument standing in the exact center of the storm. He had sacrificed himself to buy me a few extra minutes of life. The entities simply walked past his frozen body. They continued their slow, silent march toward me. I was chained to the tower. I could not run. I closed my eyes, leaned my head back against the freezing steel, and waited for the absolute cold to take me. The three pale entities stood directly over me. The violent blizzard whipped around their skeletal frames, but they were completely still. They looked down at me. They had no eyes to see. They had no faces to show emotion. They were simply voids of ancient, absolute cold. I was physically anchored to the communication tower. I could not move my arms. I could not turn my head. I waited for the killing blow. The tallest entity slowly reached out. Its long, translucent fingers hovered inches away from my face. It did not grab my throat. It simply placed a single, freezing finger directly against the center of my chest. The temperature drop was instantaneous and completely overwhelming. The cold bypassed my heavy winter clothing. It bypassed my skin and my muscles. It pierced directly into my heart. My physical body simply shut down. My vision faded into absolute black. I took one final agonizing breath of the thin mountain air. I closed my eyes and surrendered to the white silence. But I did not die. I woke up to a massive rhythmic vibration. The heavy, suffocating weight of the blizzard was completely gone. I slowly opened my eyes. The sky above me was a brilliant, blinding blue. The sun was shining brightly against the mountain peaks. The violent storm had vanished as quickly as it had arrived. The vibration shaking the concrete roof was not the wind. It was the heavy rotors of a military medical evacuation helicopter. The massive aircraft was hovering 30 feet above the outpost. Fast rope cables dropped from the side doors. A heavily armed quick reaction force descended onto the roof. The rescue operators wore white winter camouflage, but they were human. They were my brothers. Two medics rushed toward me. They were completely horrified by what they saw. They used heavy hydraulic wire cutters to sever the nylon strap connecting me to the steel tower. My body was suffering from severe hypothermia. My tactical gear was fused together by thick layers of solid ice. They carefully loaded me onto a thermal rescue stretcher. As they carried me toward the helicopter, I turned my head. I looked back at the center of the roof. Captain Edwards was still standing there. He had not moved a single inch. He was perfectly preserved inside a massive, solid block of white ice. He looked exactly like a marble statue of a fallen warrior. His face was locked in a mask of absolute defiance. He had faced the monsters of the mountain, and he had held his ground. The rescue team breached the interior of Outpost November. The military reports I read years later detailed a scene of impossible destruction. They found the heavy steel exterior doors shattered like fragile glass. They descended into the basement. They found the walls covered in toxic black soot from the diesel fire. And in the center of the ashes, they found Sergeant Miller. He was kneeling on the concrete floor, completely frozen solid, reaching his empty arms out toward nothing. They searched the entire mountain valley for 3 days. They never found the body of Private Jackson. The pale entities had taken him into the deep snow. He belonged to the storm now. The military command classified the entire incident. They blamed a sudden, catastrophic weather anomaly. They claimed that the primary heating systems of the facility had suffered a mechanical failure. They officially stated that my team had died of standard environmental exposure. They sealed the massive entrance of Outpost November with 10 feet of solid, reinforced concrete. They erased the coordinates from the active deployment grids. I spent 6 months in a secure military hospital. The doctors treated the severe frostbite on my hands and my face. They gave me a psychological evaluation and an honorable medical discharge. I left the military. I moved to the middle of the Arizona desert. I bought a small house in the hottest, driest climate I could find. I spend my days sitting in the blazing summer sun, but the heat does not help. The doctors cured the physical damage to my skin, but they could not see what the entity had done to my core. The cold did not leave me on that mountain. It anchored itself deep inside my bones. It is a permanent freezing infection. Even in the middle of the desert summer, I wear heavy winter clothing. I keep the heaters in my house running at maximum capacity. But when I look into the bathroom mirror, my lips are always a pale, sickly blue. When I exhale, I can always see my breath forming thick, white clouds in the warm air. And sometimes in the dead of night, my television turns on by itself. The screen displays nothing but heavy, gray static. But if I listen closely to the white noise, I do not hear electrical interference. I hear the deafening roar of a mountain blizzard. I hear the sound of heavy steel breaking. And I hear Captain Edwards calling out my name from the freezing dark. The white silence is not just a place on a map. It is a disease, and I brought it home with me. End of transmission. The Pamir Mountains hold secrets that are older than human history. Outpost November was designed to monitor the actions of living men. It was never equipped to defend against the things that hunt in the frozen dark. As I told you at the start of this briefing, bringing these classified files to the surface is a massive undertaking. We battle the algorithm every single day. If you made it to the end of this hour-long mission, you belong to the elite tier of Task Force Seraph. I need you to report in. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think was waiting outside those heavy steel doors. Hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you are new here. Your support is the only thing that allows us to deploy on these terrifying operations. Stay warm, operators. Keep your radios tuned. Captain out.